In this movie, we're going to sort of look at the two polar opposites of protecting your workbook. One, at the one extreme, is mark it as final, which discourages people from editing it. And the other extreme, we can encrypt it with a password so that somebody either can't open up the workbook and or cannot modify it if they do open up the workbook. So I've got a workbook that I am concerned about. It's got some content in it that I don't want to lose or have altered. And I've put a lot of work into it, and so I want to protect it in some way. There's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this. One is to mark the workbook as final. And we can do that by going to Alt-F, the backstage area, left-click Protect Workbook, and then left-click the top choice, Mark as Final. And it says, let readers know the workbook is final and make it read-only. So I'm going to left-click that. This workbook will be marked as final and then saved. So I'm going to say OK. The document has been marked as final to indicate that editing is complete and that this is the final version of the document. And it goes on to say some other things that I'm just going to describe for you rather than read that paragraph. At the top of the workbook, it says marked as final. An author has marked this workbook as final to discourage editing. And that's all this does, is discourage editing. It doesn't prevent anybody from editing, because right next to that sentence, it says edit anyway. But the workbook is in read-only mode, which means you can't make any changes to this workbook and save this workbook in this location with some changes, even if you do the following, and that is to left-click Edit Anyway, because now we don't have the final version of the workbook. But here's what I can do. I can put a snarky little hello in there, press Alt-F, go back to the Protect Workbook section and remark it as final, and I've been able to edit this workbook, have it saved, and mark it back as read-only after I make a change, and nobody's the wiser. Unless in this case the only thing in the workbook is the change that I made. So this has some functionality, but it's limited. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm going to left-click Edit Anyway and turn that off basically. At the other end of the spectrum, we can encrypt the workbook with a password. And there's a couple different ways we can do this. One way gives you more options than the other way. So we're going to start with the second of those, which is the one with the fewer options, and that is back where we were before. Alt-F, going to the backstage area, Protect Workbook, encrypt the workbook with a password. This password is a password that somebody's going to be asked to present when they open up the workbook. And if they don't have the password, they won't be able to open up the workbook. So that's one way to protect it. The risk is that you may forget your password, because it says caution, if you lose or forget the password, it cannot be recovered. Then it goes on to tell you to keep it in a safe place. That is not, in a strict sense, absolutely true. There are applications, programs, freely available, and some you can pay for, on the web that you can download and recover a workbook with a password. You may lose some macros in the process, though. And I'm going to close this, cancel this, go back into the workbook by pressing Escape, and now we're going to go to the Save As dialog box, which we can get to by pressing Alt-F-A, B, and in this drop-down, it says General Options. Not sure why it says General Options, because for the most part what this is a way to set up a password. We can create a backup copy, though, and we can recommend that the user opens it up as read-only by checking either one of those checkboxes. But what we can also do here is set up a password to open, which is exactly the same as we just saw. It's an encrypted password that somebody has to present when they go to open up or attempt to open up the workbook, or a password to modify the workbook. So you can set up either one of these or both. A suggestion is that if you want to protect the workbook, set up a password to modify the workbook, and don't set up a password to open up the workbook, just in case you forget the password, because you can still open up the workbook, save a copy of it, and then modify that, which is also a risk to setting up a password to modify, because as you can do that, so can somebody else. They can open up the workbook, save a copy of it that's not protected with a password at that point, and then modify away. So those are the two extremes of protecting your workbook. We can mark it as final, which discourages somebody from editing and presents the workbook to them in read-only mode. Or we can encrypt the workbook with a password so that you can't even open up the workbook unless you have that password, and or set up a password to modify the workbook. But all of these protection mechanisms have their limitations, and they're not foolproof, and you should know that you can't rely on these 100%.